For those of you who have been following along on the series in this distance learning class on History of Baptists, you'll note that I am seated for the first time in the lecture. That's because I get tired of standing. I don't think it's fair that you are sitting at home in front of your computer or on a couch with a remote in your hand, and I got to stand. I think it's sort of the same problem we have in our churches. We have the pastor stand to preach. People get to sit, padded pews, and relax. I think the church, and sometimes even the lecture hall, is run like a bad ball team. Let's just pick a bad ball team. Let's say, the Dallas Cowboys. If you go to Texas Stadium, what do you see? You see 22 people on the field in dire need of rest and 50,000 in the stands in dire need of exercise. So I'm going to sit down with you, and we are going to start on the magisterial reformations. We have heretofore walked up to and included the dissenting movements. Men such as Savonarola, John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, men who paid the price for a belief that the Bible needs to be in the language of the people, the church needs to be free, that there is not one voice, and that the Roman Catholic doctrines that had developed, such as the veneration of the saints, iconic worship, etc., were wrong. Now, in this lecture, we are going to cover the four groups that held to some reformation or an animosity toward a free church movement. What I'm saying is this. Look under the lecture questions of the notes in Lecture 3. How did the church at Rome become such a corrupt institution? What were the major issues that drove the Reformation? What were the distinctions between the various waves? You've heard me state that I believe that the Reformation wasn't one movement, but actually 6 movements. Well, what differentiated these? They are profound. These aren't tiny little differences. They are differences that substantially made the movements different from one another. The thesis is this. Each one of the 4 movements, and we're going to discuss the movements in Germany, England, and France. Each one of the 4 movements held to these differences from the free church movement. Number 1, an external authority. Luther, Calvin, Rome, even England, they all believed in an external authority. They allowed for, and in some cases insisted upon, an external authority outside of the local church. In the case of the English Reformation, it was the bishopric, and quite frankly, the king. In the French Swiss, Calvin, it was an oligarchy. Magisterial authority, that's number 2. Magisterial authority, a belief in some state involvement in the church. Either to tax, and thus infant baptism, or in the power to legislate. 3, a common belief, obviously, because of their ties to the state, was a belief in infant baptism. To count the baby, you got to get him in the church to register him. To get him in the church to register him, teach him that if the baby ain't baptized, he's going to hell. 4, they all, and please underline this, all had a common hatred, vituperation toward, hatred of the Anabaptists. Remember, the Anabaptists aren't reformers. We, free church people, you will constantly hear me use the word Anabaptist. We are all Anabaptist, to one degree or another, if you're a free church person. If you hold to a believer's church and a free church, you are an Anabaptist. Now, we don't like the term itself, but we hold to the same perpetuity there. So when I use that term, just remember free church or remember believer's church. The Anabaptists were not reformers. They were radical reformers. We didn't want to fix anything. We wanted out. We're going to start it again. Start it right this time. They held to central tenets that defied any state control. They were hunted by Luther, hunted by Calvin, hunted by King Henry VIII, hunted by the Roman Catholic Church. That's the one differentiation between these 6 ways of Reformation. They were commonly, uniquely, and ubiquitously, completely hated. All right, part 1, Roman Catholic corruption. Let's walk through it and see how Rome gets in this position, because their fundamental teachings on salvation are going to be shown here in a minute. Decline of papal authority. Pope Boniface VII and the Unum Sanctum. Now, Boniface VII was fighting with Philip, the king of France, over taxation. Basically, here's the question. Wait a minute. If the church and the state are working together, who gets what percentage? Right? It's a common question. All right, if I, as the king, get to nominate what bishops I want, what do I, as the bishop, get to name of the king's people? See the fight, the tension between the two? Well, Philip actually captures Boniface, puts him in jail. The king puts the Pope in jail. And in so doing, he obviously shows, I'm more powerful than you are. So what does Boniface do? He issues a document that you have to know. It's a papal bull. And you have to know this. It's one of the few dates you have to know, and it's one of the few documents you have to know. Unum Sanctum. Unum Sanctum of 1382. Please watch. It was the ultimate claim of papal authority. One will. Unum Sanctum. There is one holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church, and we declare, state, define, and pronounce that it is altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff. Oh my goodness. You know what he's saying? He was agreeing with Cyprian, who said it in a very cute way. He was saying you can't have God as Father and not have the church as your mother. You ain't a member of the Catholic Church, you're not saved. Now, what was he also setting up? He was setting up the ability to excommunicate somebody. All I got to do is kick you out of the church and you're out of heaven. You go to hell. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. I hold the keys. Remember the papal view of the keys. Belief that no earthly regent can challenge without eternal damnation. Now, notice how he holds this over the king's authority. You're going to see this develop, certainly when you get into the fight between different popes and different kings. All he has to do is turn to the people and go, guess what? This king isn't of God. He's going to hell. You don't have to pay him taxes. You know, you don't have to fight in his army. I'm out. It worked. It worked. Hildebrand pulled it on Henry IV. Hildebrand, when he excommunicated the king, King Henry IV, he said, you know what? People, you don't have to follow him anymore. That was his power. Because the people are willing to listen to him because I'm going to be dead a whole lot longer than I'm alive. I'm going to listen to that pope. Let's look at the decline of papal authority. Why were the people actually not listening to the pope like they should? Well, how about he gambled away Rome? It's called the Babylonian captivity of the church. Avignon papacy, between 309 and 377, actually a little wider. You don't have to know the dates, but it goes on to about 417. Clement V really owed France a lot of money, and he couldn't pay. And they called in their marker. We need our money. Where's my money? Well, I ain't got any money. Well, you got to pay us for something. I ain't got anything. How about this? Let's move the seat of the Holy Roman Catholic Church to Avignon, France. Will that pay off my debt? Sure. He didn't care. I'll move it. He moves it out of Rome. He sold the papacy to Avignon, France. Obviously, it's a great honor to have the head of the Catholic Church in France for the French king. But now you got to fight. It's called the Great Schism. You see it there? The Great Schism of 378 to 417. Rome, the people who lived in Rome were saying, what are you doing? You can't sell it. There's no building there. Rome is Rome. Nuh-uh, he says. Rome's in Avignon now. You know what happens? Well, you go if you want to, but we're going to set up our own pope. The buildings are still here. Between 1378 and 1417, roughly 39 years, you got two popes. I'm pope. Nuh-uh. I'm pope. This was a classic west side, east side kind of setup. We are supreme. Nuh-uh, no, you're not. We are. Oh, yeah? Well, I excommunicate you. You can't. I excommunicated you already. You can imagine who are we going to listen to? This guy's kicking this guy out. This guy says he already kicked him out. Which pope are we loyal to? Well, what king can give us the most? This Babylonian captivity of the church, this Avignon sale, and then the subsequent back and forth. I'm disqualifying you. You can't disqualify me. You're already disqualified. I'm the boss of you. You're not the boss of me. Went on for almost a century. Do you see how people were less and less inclined to actually listen? Well, which one are you going to be loyal to? All this contributed to this: a lessening of the power and influence over the regional kingdoms, lessening of the trust of the laity, a more desperate Roman Catholic Church. You have to listen to us. All right, part 2, the church at the dawn of the Reformation. You see how this is the backdrop for Wycliffe and Huss and these guys. You got 2 Romes. You got 2 guys. One calls himself the Pope. The other one calls himself the Pope. And what do you call the other guy? Anti-Pope. You understand why? Antichrist. It's calling him the devil. So here's where we find the church at the dawn of the Reformation. Here's the positive features. Because of the Reformation and because of the Renaissance, Luther and guys like that were able to do what they did. The Renaissance was the rebirth of literacy, the call back to learning how to read, the re-education of children. Because the people can read, if they can read the Bible, I'm going to say it this way, an open Bible and an open mind will make a free churcher every time. Because if they can read the Bible and see that they're a priest before God, just like the pastor is, that they have an equal voice, they're going to be free church people. So this greatly helped. Humanism by Erasmus, and I'm talking about classic humanism, not humanism the way we know it, as in the Humanist Manifestos 1 and 2. But true humanism was a belief that every person should be educated. Every person should read. Every person stands before God, accountable before God. It was a classic call to knowledge and philosophy. I love philosophy. I love hanging out in the coffee shops that you could name, and I can name 2. Love hanging out there. I'll pay $5 for a cup of coffee if it means I'm talking philosophy with people who think they're intelligent. If they think they're intelligent, I believe I can lead them to the cross. Because true intelligence, Christianity has nothing to fear from intelligence. Christianity has nothing to fear from philosophy. We have nothing to hide from. And that was the call to true humanism. Erasmus was right. The problem is Erasmus didn't believe his own conclusions. Because Erasmus said every man needs to learn to read, but by the way, don't read anything that disagrees with Rome. Makes no sense. But true humanism was a call to investigate it yourself, study it yourself. Printing press, 1445, Gutenberg. 1415 as well, you had movements where you could now get the Bible out. You can get sermons out without having to hand copy them. Great rise in religious interest. Quite frankly, it is sort of like the postmodern period. Because now there's tons of interest. We live in the era of Miss Cleo. We live in the era of psycho hotlines. We live in the era where people are willing to believe anything because there's great religious fervor, mysticism. The Dalai Lama is making speeches every 5 minutes. Various movements are claiming to be godlike. Why? Because everybody's sort of religious. Atheism really is suffering in the postmodern period because you got to believe in something. Even if it's an inner light and a divine spark in your inner child, who I believe desperately needs spanking. Everybody believes in something. Now, negative features of the Roman Catholic Church that directly contributed to the Reformation. Oh, you have to know every one of these phrases. The 3 definitions. Under point number 2, point A, higher clergy among the popes and the cardinals. Number 1, simony, as in Simon of Magnus, Acts chapter 8. Simony was the selling and buying of church offices. Dear Father, the best churches were not going to the smartest person or the most religious, the most spiritual. It was going to the person who had the most money. In class, I'll go into great detail and ask people, from what city do you come? Who here? Let me ask you this. Who here is from a big city? Big city. Tell me the city, my brother. Cleveland. Huge city. Great city, by the way. Cleveland. Where are you from, my brother?
Miami.
Miami, Florida. Who here is from a tiny city? Anybody here from a small town? Even born in one? You may not live there now. Where were you born, my brother?
Appomattox.
Appomattox, Virginia. Certainly. A very small town. How many people live in Appomattox at any given time? 15. Let's say 15. Yeah. And how many live in Miami? How many live in Cleveland?
A whole lot more.
3, 4 million?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say easily. Certainly Parma and all that area. Now, what are we dealing with? All right, let's say we're up for pastors. We've made it through the training. Do you want to go to Appomattox? Or do you want to go to Cleveland? Cleveland's got the big church. Parsonage has got a pool and a sauna and a tub. You get a country club membership there. Appomattox, they give you a tree stand and a pickup truck. Where do you want to go? Yeah. People who are the climbers, they want to go to Cleveland. Well, who's going to get it? I've memorized the New Testament, he says. But I know all the creeds by heart, he says. I got the most money, I say. I pay him, who's the bishop in Cleveland, and he gives me the church in Cleveland. That's simony. The biggest churches, the most prominent churches were up for sale. And what happens to the church in Cleveland? If the rest of you are members in Cleveland and I show up, I may not even be able to spell Bible, much less find a book in it. But I got the cash. I don't really care about the church. I like all the bennies. I like the benefits of being able to get White Castles in the middle of the night. I like the benefits of being right there near Sandusky, being able to go to all these various events and go to all the concerts, and I'm able to hang out. And you know what? Church is the last thing on my mind. And the church fails. The spiritual depth of the church, even though it may have been good at one time, begins to lessen. Where do you think the most devout people go? Appomattox. Do you, as a matter of church history, know that every great revival that has taken place in the last 400 years in America took place not in the big cities, but in small towns? Asbury, Kentucky. Northampton? These were backwoods places, but they were pastored by devout men, led by devout men and women. See, what ended up happening is the Reformation didn't launch in Frankfurt, Berlin. The first wave is in Wittenberg, and nobody wants to be in Wittenberg. But the guys who didn't have money but had the spiritual tenacity ended up in small places. So great revivals will more likely come from Appomattox before they'll ever come from Cleveland or Miami. Welcome to our world. We continue. Multiplication of benefices. Commission. Just write it down. The best salesman made the highest amount of money. Benefices was the right to receive income from selling offices. This is, let me say it this way, Scamway. I don't make money by selling the offices. I make money by selling you the right to sell offices. It's a pyramid scheme. Nothing's new. 3, real estate. The church had so much land, it's confiscated a lot of it, but it had so much land, it had to keep it up. The church was losing money just by upkeep of its own real estate. It's going into debt with more and more land, including building the largest church in the history of the world, the Basilica at Rome. And St. Peter's was supposed to be so large that they couldn't afford the construction costs, and thus we enter into the period of the German Reformation. Lower clergy. Well, what's the problem with the lower clergy? There's too many of them. Why? Let's be really honest, ladies and gentlemen. Being a preacher is easy if you're lazy. Right? If you're willing to be a slob, what do? I'll give you a couple of hints. Number 1, get a boat and name it Visitation. So when you're out fishing, you can tell your people I was out on visitation. Golf and tell people you were ministering to the Greens. They'll think it's a people. The Green family, I don't know them. Nobody looking over your shoulder. You can come and leave when you want. Don't do any visits. Tell them you're in your study time, but you're actually doing remote therapy. Anybody wants to be a preacher if it means they don't have to work in the fields. There was too many preachers. It was too easy. It looked too easy. If you're a good and godly man, it ain't easy, is it? It's hard. Ministry's tough. Midnight phone calls, hospital visits, and I have a weak stomach. So I'm in the hospital room hugging a neck and holding a hand and praying with somebody and hearing noises coming out of this tube going, I can't take that stuff. But you do it. You're the shepherd. The lower priests wanted to be priests because they thought it was easy. They were undereducated. If I need money to get in, I don't need education. I'm busy making up my connections, much more than studying. 3, too many privileges. Getting fat. I'm not talking about physically fat. I'm talking about spiritually fat, comfortable. They weren't suffering for the faith. They were indulgent. 4, they were becoming rich, coming to the point where during the days of Martin Luther, if you wanted a hospital visit, your priest would charge you. Sure, I'll make it to the hospital. 1 time for $6, 2 for $10. They were getting rich. They were becoming sexually immoral. And this is something we deal with today as well with the priests. But when you tell them that they can't get married, and you tell them that sleeping with a woman is wrong, what options do you give them? They had to get away with the flesh somehow. Many were now illegitimate fathers. Some of the popes were as well. In the laity, what's going on with them? Relics. Here's a problem. Here's what they were seeing. A relic was supposedly a holy piece of furniture, a holy piece of something, right? There were too many to actually be believable. And some people actually did travel, and they would come to some church. I'll give you examples. They were expensive to purchase. All right, here comes a salesman who says, I've got pieces of Mary's dress. But there's only a few number of them, and if you want one, you have to pay for it. And each church was raising money to buy their relics because it meant something to have these relics in your church. Come to the church that has clippings from John's beard. Come to the church that has a tooth from St. Peter. But if you're going to have a tooth from St. Peter, you need to pay for it. So they were raising money from the people to buy these relics. Notice, the Castle Church in Wittenberg, that's where Luther's serving, contained over 5,000 relics. Among them, 35 fragments from the actual cross, milk from the Virgin Mary, and a piece of the burning bush of Moses. Now, even a person who can't read understands that that's a little stupid. Feast days. Remember, Rome, to operate, has to jump over the New Testament and go back to Old Testament. Everything they do, naming themselves priests, having feast days instead of doing the sacrifices, they do a lot of Old Testament referencing back and forth. Well, a feast day was set up like our fellowship supper, except what do we do in our fellowship supper? We who are free church people. Fellowship supper means that the wife on Saturday has to fix something, put it in a casserole dish, make sure that on the bottom of the casserole dish her name is written in nail polish, right? Get up extra early on Sunday morning, finish the deviled eggs, and take it to church. We set up the table, 81 different kinds of deviled eggs. Somebody inevitably brings a bucket of KFC, and what do? We eat. Except in the feast days, they charged tickets. To sit at the table for the feast day, you had to pay for your seat. And the problem was, it was such a good money-making situation, there was too many feast days. They were naming feast days after saints who hadn't actually lived. St. Crispin, they were just mythological guys. And you're going, great. Who is he again? Patron saint of dinosaurs. Oh. We're having dinosaur meat. Buy tickets. You see what I'm saying? There was a scam going on. The church was a restaurant. Veneration of saints. So much so that it was almost like the Bible wasn't necessary. Christ certainly wasn't. If I'm hurting, who do I call? The patron saint of hurting. If I got a headache, to whom do I pray? The patron saint of migraines. Well, how do I pray to him? Now watch. If you can follow this, you're set up. I don't have time to pray. I'm working in the fields 15 hours a day. Oh, well, I'll pray for you. Really? Sure. Well, that's very nice of you, Father. Well, wait a minute, though. I'll light a candle for you, because in the Old Testament, when the incense was burning in the altar, the prayers were being offered up to God. I'll light a candle for you. And I'll keep the candle lit for a little something, something. To get rid of my migraine? Yep. I'll pray to Saint Migraine. Watch. Magic in the Mass. The host. It was almost mythological how they developed the doctrine of transubstantiation. Don't spill the blood of Christ. You are masticating the Master as you would chew. And so this entire thing developed over the wine and how it was fixed. Continue. Purgatory. Inventing to explain sins after salvation. Now, I'm going to do this very quickly because it has to deal with the 7 sacraments, but let's walk through this very fast. If you pay attention, you'll understand why Rome was so corrupt at this point and still remains that way. All right, I was saved in 1982, but it's now 2050, and I die. What about my sins at salvation? Are my sins forgiven, past, present, and future? Yes or no? Nod. Yes or no? Past, present, and future. So God knew in 1982 what sins I would commit in 2050? And His blood covers that sin too? Yeah, not in Rome. The moment you are saved, well, let's go back. I was born in I'm an old man. But what if I died as an infant? Where do I go? They tell my father and mother, if the baby is baptized, as in the New Testament equivalent to circumcision in the Old Testament, told you there's a jump, didn't I? My baby goes to heaven. Well, what happens? What are you doing? At the moment I'm baptized as an infant, I am forgiven of my original sin, and I'm forgiven of my sins past and present. But, okay, now I'm 13. What do? Well, at 13 you go through what? Confirmation. That's right. Well, what's confirmation? It's the equivalent to the Old Testament bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah. Doink. Well, what happens then? Oh, that's when you're infiltrated by the Holy Spirit. And you're forgiven again. Okay, so at 13, I'm forgiven. I was baptized, I'm saved at whatever, 8 days. Forgiven at 13. But now I die at 70. What about the sins between 13 and 70? Let me tell you how it works. Every time you come and take the Lord's Supper, you are being freshly saved. That's why they have Christ on the cross still, because Jesus' death on the cross is constantly being reenacted, literally, because there's His blood every time you take the Lord's Supper. So every time I take the Lord's Supper, I'm being freshly saved. Great, but it's not the Lord's Supper, it's the Eucharist, right? If I'm taking the Lord's Supper and doing the Eucharist, here's my question. I do that every Sunday. What if I died on a Tuesday? Well, we're going to do the Mass every day then. Okay, that's why they have Mass every day. But what if I take the Mass at 8 a.m., but I died at 10 p.m.? What about my sins between 8 a.m. and 10 p.m.? Last rites. All right, but let's take me as an example. I died at 70, took the Mass at 8 a.m., died at 10 p.m., and I got last rites. I'm okay. But what about my uncle, Uncle Bob? Uncle Bob was baptized and confirmed, but he never went back. Is he in heaven or not? Not. See, he's not in heaven. He's in the holding cell, preparing for heaven, called purgatory. How do I get him out? Indulgence. Say Our Fathers, Hail Marys, pay, whatever. The whole system of Roman Catholic salvation developed over these questions. The entire system. What if Uncle Bob comes back at age 50? He ain't been in church in 37 years from when he was 13. How does he catch up? Well, he needs to make confession. But he can't confess to Christ. You just told me that the Pope is the vicar. Well, yeah, but the Pope appointed a guy to be in your church. His name is the priest. And the priest can say these words, Te absolvum, you are forgiven. How does he say it? I have to do some things, give some things. Say 15 Our Fathers, say 71 Hail Marys, and you're done. They even developed in the medieval ages a chart. Tell me your sins, my son. Bless me, Father, for I've sinned. How long has it been since your last confession? 37 years. You got a lot of catching up to do. Tell me your sins. Oh, I cussed. I lied. I cheated on my wife. Okay, cussed. 37 years. You got to say 600,000 Our Fathers. I don't have that kind of time. I can light a candle for you. I can say the novenas for you. And bada bing, you've got the Reformation period. Purgatory, attendance, faithfulness. People stopped coming. If people stop coming, how do we get them in there so they can be freshly saved? This developmental, gradual, cradle to the grave salvation, even if you died without receiving extreme unction, last rites, they had a way to get you through. This developmental salvation became the order of the day for the Roman Catholicism. They needed to dictate their doctrine, and it became their fatal flaw. Since Rome couldn't ever admit that they had ever made a mistake because of the unum sanctum, they have to fix it as they go. That's why Rome to this day will not apologize for the Crusades. Why they won't apologize for Galileo, they'll simply say we were misunderstood. To admit they were wrong would be to tear apart their entire system. That's why the priests can't get married. That's why they'll never change any of their stances. So I've already done it. I've given you their 7 sacraments. Baptism, confirmation, penance, communion, marriage, by a priest, by the way. It has to be by a priest. Orders by the clergy, extreme unction. All these things, which are testable, all 7 points are always going to be testable. All these 7 things were their way of keeping people in the church and tied to it. Now, in the midst of this, Luther rises up. Part 3, the German Reformation, Martin Luther. You don't need to know anything about his early life except this. Martin Luther was a good monk. He was Augustinian, a student, an educator. As a matter of fact, he said this, I was a good monk, and I kept the rule of my order so strictly that I may say that if ever a monk got to heaven by his monkery, it was I. If I had kept on any longer, I would have killed myself with my vigils, my prayers, my readings, and my other work. If he was eating and spilled a little bit of porridge, he would say an extra blessing on that because he was afraid it wasn't in the cup to be blessed. This guy is hardcore. He makes a trip to Rome, and there his eyes are wide open because he runs into a place that he thought was going to be the greatest religious experience of his life, and he runs into the biggest orgy of debauchery he had ever seen. Couldn't believe these fat, wealthy priests were in Rome. He couldn't imagine why everybody was running around like an orgy. But you see, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow somebody will say a novena for me and I'm forgiven. He's climbing up the Santa Scala, saying prayers for his uncle who he believes is in purgatory. He comes back from Rome disillusioned, heartsick. He's serving way out in the middle of nowhere in Wittenberg. He is seen. For Southern Baptists, they say Nashville is the Holy Land. You know, for National Baptists, it's Dallas, because that's where the headquarters are. He had gone to Dallas, he had gone to Nashville, and he was expecting to see holiness personified, and what he saw was a drunken, nasty night of nothing. He was disillusioned, heartsick, and now he goes back to Wittenberg to serve the people. And in the midst of this, in walks a break with Rome. In walks a guy by the name of Tetzel that we'll talk about. They were selling indulgences. Indulgences was a way to get out of purgatory, and they were selling it to raise money for St. Peter's Basilica. And there was no one who was a better salesman than John Tetzel. Tetzel. You'll see him as point 3, a Dominican friar who'd been sent by Pope Leo, who was singing this song. He would walk into the middle of the city in Wittenberg, stand up in the middle of the city square and sing the song in German. Every time a coin in the coffer rings, another soul from purgatory springs. Can you imagine? Here's Luther, a well-intentioned, misled, misguided, wrong, but well-intentioned monk trying to love people. He ain't raising a lot of money, not making a lot of anything. Here comes this salesman who sets out a jar that gets filled, puts out a bucket that gets filled. He's eventually having to drag buckets behind him. Because you're telling people that Aunt Lucy is going to make it out of purgatory into heaven if they give a certain amount of money. Luther had been raised, trained. That didn't sound like any of his training. Certainly didn't sound like any of his scripture. But he's got to disagree. If he's going to disagree, look what happens. He gets saved. He gets saved by reading through the book of Romans. And in Romans 1:17, the just shall live by their faith. I'm justified by Christ, and thus my faith, not my adherence to Rome, not my following of a pope, certainly not the popes I saw. And a saved preacher will be a better preacher. He begins preaching through the Bible. And when Johann Tetzel walks in the middle of this, look what he says. He had grace and power from the Pope to offer forgiveness, even if somebody had slept with the Holy Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, as long as the contribution be put in the coffer. Furthermore, he said, he wouldn't want to trade places in heaven with St. Peter, for he had redeemed more souls than with his indulgences than Peter with his sermons. Furthermore, if anybody put money in the coffer for a soul in purgatory, the soul would leave purgatory for heaven in the moment one could hear the penny hit the bottom. He was sick. Here's what he does. Luther wants to fix Rome. That's it. If you understand that, you've got the German Reformation. He doesn't want to break with it. He wants to fix it. Everybody knows the story of posting of the 95 Theses on the castle church door at Wittenberg. But please remember, he did it in Latin. But you're in Germany. Who understands Latin in Germany? Other priests. Other monks. All Luther wanted to do was to change Rome by starting a dialogue with other priests. He posted it on the castle door. It was an unbelievably courageous act. Absolutely. Absolutely. Problem? That he only wanted to fix the priests. He was trying to get up a group of people. What's the other problem? I told you the printing press was out. Somebody tore it down and translated it against Luther's wishes. Luther did not want it translated. It's in German. People are reading it. He's right. He's right. A priest is right. He's calling the Pope dirty. I mean, you should read the 95 Theses. They're unbelievable. He makes some statements where he says, how dare you, in the name of God, be nothing but a salesman? He goes on and on and on. He's infuriated, but he didn't know they were going to be translating it. It became a bestseller the day it came out. People were agreeing with him, and he was saying, how'd you get it? Here's the problem. He had Reformation intent. He said the Pope can't remit penalties that God has given. He's critical of the papacy for taking money from the people. At both the Diet of Augsburg and the Leipzig Disputation, Luther participates in the debates. Each time, he's almost arrested. Each time in the debates, he's reluctant. Luther likes the spotlight, don't get me wrong, but Luther was dragged into this unwillingly. People are standing with him, we're like, we're with you, man. And Luther's going, this was supposed to be between us. They're saying, no, we're with you. What's next? The problem is Rome forced his hand. Always remember this about Martin Luther and the Reformation. Martin Luther did not jump from Rome. He was pushed. Martin Luther did not want a revolution. Martin Luther wanted a reformation. Each time in his debates, he believes it can be fixed. It gets back to the Pope, who this young Luther boy is. Luther, actually, is the way it's spelled, with no H. And the Pope, how dare you, you're not even at a big church. You're not at Cleveland. You're not at Miami. You're in Appomattox. Who are you? What is Madison Heights? Who is Luther? The Pope writes a papal bull called Exerce Domine, rise up, O Lord. Because I'll tell you who he was getting a lot of followers. 21 months after the 95 Theses, the Pope's had enough. He says, you will be excommunicated if you don't recant in the city square within 2 months of you getting this letter. Because it takes time to deliver it from Rome up to Germany. Within 2 months, if you don't recant, stand in the middle of the city square and say, I was wrong for picking on the Pope, the 95 Theses are wrong, his response. Please underline this date, you got to know it. Even more so than the date of actually nailing the 95 Theses, you have to know this date. Point 4, his response, December the 10th, 1520. Why do you have to know it? It's the moment that the Reformation actually began, in my estimation. Luther stands in the city square, holds up Exerce Domine. I mean, everybody knows it. It's been read. When it arrives in Wittenberg, it's read in the city square. Luther, you got 2 months. Luther gets up, December the 10th. By the way, more than 2 months. And lights it on fire. A letter from the Pope condemning him to hell if he doesn't recant. Luther's a dramatic man. He knows what he's doing. He stands up and he says, I've been told to recant this thing. And the place went ballistic. He was kicked, but he led a revolution. Problem is, he didn't disagree so much. Please notice Luther's theology. The law is distinguished from grace. He said, you guys cannot keep making up laws that we have to follow. We are saved by grace, sola gratia. If you understand that, you don't need to know anything else about Luther's doctrine, with the one exception. Luther didn't have a problem with infant salvation, infant baptism. Luther simply said, you can't keep making things up. There's another man in France. He's actually French himself, but he moves to Switzerland. It's part 4, the French-Swiss Reformation. John Calvin, born in 1509 in Noyon. His father was excommunicated after being an accountant for the bishop. Here's what we know about him. At the University of Paris in 1533, he's working with the dean of students, Nicholas Kopp, in writing the lecture. Now, just like here, just like every other university, there's an opening convocation, a closing convocation, a first convocation, and a last one. Kopp was most dean of students are basically fun-loving guys. They're not always the most academic of people. And in this case, Nicholas Kopp was very academic. And at a Catholic university, University of Paris, Nicholas Kopp is a reformer. He's caught wind. This is not the same movement, by the way. 1517, 1520, we're now in 1533. So we're talking about a generation later, 13 years later. But there, at the University of Paris, a highly Catholic university, Nicholas Kopp and his best friend, John Calvin, this kid, because we're 33. He's what, 24 years old? Calvin's 24 years old. Kopp comes up with his address. Everybody marches in, along with the bishop, the cardinal, all these people there for the opening convocation. Nicholas Kopp rises to this great honor of giving the convocation address. He preaches a sermon in favor of the Reformation, breaking from Rome. Unbelievable. You cannot possibly imagine that moment. I wish to the Father I could have seen it. It causes a riot. He's chased out of the city, but before he's chased out of the city, who helped you with this? He gave up his buddy in a heartbeat. If I'm going down, Calvin's going with me. Calvin helped me. At least it was rumored. They too become fugitives. They become fugitives. All John Calvin ever wanted to do was to write. He was a believer in Jesus Christ. He was not tied to Roman Catholicism, although he was raised in it. He was a firm believer in Christ. All he wanted to do was study Scripture. It's all he wanted to do. He'd studied, his first book had been on philosophy. He loved Seneca. Commentary on Seneca's writings. He loved thought. He loved the process. He was an apologist. That was Calvin. Calvin was the reluctant reformer. All he ever wanted to do was study. I'll prove it to you. Calvin the reformer. Notice this. From 1533 to 36, he travels France, Switzerland, Italy. All he's doing is studying. He comes out, by the way, at the age of 27 with his first Institutes. And the Institutes was forever and a day always under negotiation. It was always being rewritten. He was constantly reworking it and enlarging upon it. The first one was only 80 pages long, 7 chapters. But it was the first systematic Protestant work. It was the first systematic Reformation work of systematic theology. 27 years old and the guy's famous. From 1537 to 1541, all he wants to do is travel and study. He's going to live on whatever money he can make from his publications. However, into his life comes Martin Bucer, B-U-C-E-R. Bucer keeps dragging him to Geneva. As a matter of fact, what's interesting, it was against his will. He's run out of the city. Bucer at one time, standing out in front, all he wants to do is go to Strasbourg and study. That's all he wants to do. All Calvin wants to do is just study. And Bucer stands in front of his door, with his door closed, trying to pray Deuteronomic curses on Calvin if he won't stay in Geneva. We need your help. Our city's under Reformation, but it's also under attack. He starts, the imprecatory psalm, break his teeth against the rocks, bring the leprosy to him. Finally, he scared Calvin into staying. But Calvin has a problem with Rome doctrinally, not positionally. Calvin totally believes that there can be an accountability externally. He is a magisterial reformer. He can set up and legislate morality. Absolutely. I'll prove it in a minute. The first time he tries to institute these rules to set up Geneva as a holy city, he's kicked out. But then he's dragged back in. And in 1541, he returns, never to leave again. Here's his theology. Calvin's goal was to make Geneva a holy city, a city ruled by the Bible. Please understand that. Please understand that. Radically different than us. He wanted to rule based on the Bible. He established, here, you have to know this word, the Constitutori. Every Thursday, Calvin and a group of leaders would meet to discipline those who had broken the law. Now, please understand this. Please pay attention. The priests, or the preachers, are also the judges. The preacher is also the mayor. Does that make sense? They were judge, jury. They would legislate. What did he do? He broke the Sabbath. 70 lashes. Every Thursday, the Constitutori would meet. He taught heresy. He wasn't in church. He bowled. Lawn bowling was greatly hated. Anything you did. If it was a sin, it was against the law. If it's against the law, you can be punished by the city. His problem with Rome was not Roman setup. It was Roman doctrine. He liked Rome. He just wanted to reposition it in Geneva. John Knox, of course, from the English world, John Knox called Geneva the most perfect city in the world. Christly, the most godly, Christ-honoring city in the world because they tried to legislate morality. His purpose was the revision of city laws, restrict immorality in Geneva with the Christian Commonwealth. You have to know the words Christian Commonwealth because you'll constantly see that. Church-state relations, the church is to lead and rule spiritually. Church discipline, listen to what Calvin said. Discipline is like the bridle to restrain and tame those who rage against the doctrine of Christ, like a spur to arouse those with little inclination, and also sometimes like a father's rod to chasten mildly with the gentleness of Christ those who seriously lapped. Protect the church for purity. If a heretic is teaching, you got to stop him. Souls are at stake. Evaluation. This was holiness by legislation. And thus the question is raised, were the people holy in Geneva, or were they just obedient? Can you legislate somebody down the aisle? Calvin's soteriology, will deal with that at another time. I simply want you to understand his theocracy. Look at point D, implications of Calvin's theocracy. On October the 27th, 1533, please underline this. You don't need to know the date, you have to know the action. On October the 27th, 1533, Calvin allowed the execution of a heretic. Michael Servetus was a heretic, absolutely. Humanist, anti-Trinitarian. He wasn't anti-Baptist, or an Anabaptist, he was anti-Trinitarian. He didn't believe in the Trinity. He was a humanist. And he was vocal about it. He made the mistake. Calvin tried to correct him by sending him the Institutes. He corrected the Institutes, wrote in the margins, and returned it. For this crime, heresy, Servetus is arrested in Geneva and burned at the stake. Can you kill somebody for heresy? The Calvinists say yes. Notice, in Defensio Orthodoxae Fidei, here's what he said. Our imaginations shudder at the terror and agony of the wretched victim. Their sense of order was horrified by the thoughts of souls destroyed by false doctrine, of churches torn asunder into parties, of the vengeance of God displayed upon them in war and in famine. And thus, yes, ladies and gentlemen, John Calvin believed you could kill a heretic. Free churchers will never. True free church, true religious liberty upon which this country is founded says this: I would live and die and fight to the death for a Muslim, a heretic, a universalist, to build a church or a mosque next to mine. Now, that means I can also stand in front of that mosque and holler, Jesus saves. But you can't kill somebody for being a heretic. Let the heathen worship. It's the point that we make in both the books Sacred Trust and Sacred Desk, which are required reading for this class. Final thing, I can summarize the English Reformation this way. King Henry VIII, if there was ever a Catholic, non-Catholic, it was King Henry VIII. The only guy to write a book entitled The Seven Sacraments was King Henry VIII. Henry loved everything about Rome except for the Pope. He wanted a divorce. An entire movement based on somebody's desire to divorce a girl. He wanted a son. They wouldn't give it to him. He leaves. Henry wanted to be Pope. You can't excommunicate me, he said. I want to get remarried. I'll excommunicate you, the Pope said. You can't. It's my church. I'm taking my ball and going home. That's why the regent in England is the head of the Church of England. He's the Pope. If you understand these fundamental points, you'll understand. In Germany, Luther had no problem with the doctrine. Calvin certainly didn't have a problem with Rome's position of being in charge. And Henry wanted London to be in charge. Magisterial reformers had doctrinal issues with Rome, thank God. But they didn't have a positional difference. They just wanted to be in charge. They were right on target with doctrine, right on target with their teachings, right on target with the doctrine of the Bible and with Christ. The problem was they were magisterial in the Reformation. When we get back together after this lecture, we will see that the radical reformers were fundamentally different because they said you cannot force someone to faith or legislate against it.